Jordan Blackwell had never started his mornings in a penthouse. The alarm on his phone cut through the quiet apartment, signaling another long day of night shifts, and he rolled out of bed with the practiced precision of a man used to carrying responsibility heavier than most would ever understand. His son, Lila, still asleep under a thin blanket, stirred slightly as he kissed the top of her head. At 38, Jordan was lean and quiet, his hands calloused from years of work in maintenance, yet gentle whenever they touched what mattered most. Breakfast was a routine, coffee brewing as he packed Lila's lunchbox, a simple assortment of sandwiches and fruit, but even in these ordinary moments, he carried a weight few noticed, a world that had long underestimated him. His uniform was worn, sleeves smudged with grease from yesterday's work on an old truck that barely started, but he straightened it with care, a silent dignity in his posture that no compliment or accolade had ever demanded. By the time he wheeled the cart down the fluorescent-lit hallway of Granite Media's lower floors, the city was still quiet, its skyline etched against a soft pre-dawn haze. Jordan's movements were measured, precise, every sweep of the mop, every turn of the handle, methodical and deliberate. Lila's backpack swung lightly from the cart as he glanced down at her sleeping form. He adjusted the strap, his eyes flicking to the dark, polished lobby that rose above them, a stark contrast to the modest apartments he called home. No one else noticed the small care he took, the silent routines that kept both his daughter and the space around him safe and orderly. He had been judged countless times for being just a janitor, his uniform, the smudges, the old boots, but he had learned long ago that the world often misread quiet competence for insignificance. Something felt different this morning. As he rounded the corner toward the main entrance, he noticed the click of high heels against marble before he saw her. Rose Whitaker, elegant, poised, a woman whose presence seemed to command even the light around her, stood at the threshold of the executive lobby. Her polished suit caught the faint glow of the morning sun through the glass wall, and the sharp line of her jaw, the careful set of her eyes, hinted at a lifetime of control and guarded emotion. She had that kind of confidence that didn't announce itself loudly but settled heavily in a room, demanding acknowledgement. Jordan's gaze met hers briefly, not with deference, not with challenge, but with a quiet recognition, a shared humanity in a space built to separate people into tiers. Then Lila stirred and muttered something under her breath, drawing Jordan's attention to a small, worn toolbox at the foot of the elevator, a relic from yesterday's repairs, left unassuming, yet precise in the care Jordan had taken. Rose's eyes followed his glance, a subtle narrowing that spoke more than words could convey. She didn't speak at first, she was evaluating, calculating, her aura polished yet momentarily disrupted by curiosity. Jordan's hands were still coated in traces of oil, the faint scent of rubber lingering, and he adjusted the lid of the toolbox before setting it back, a small act unnoticed by anyone else but somehow not by her. The child saw what everyone else missed. Lila's small eyes tracked the exchange silently, sensing the undercurrent of tension and respect forming between them. Before we go deeper into what he discovered that day, tell us where you're watching from and do not forget to subscribe, because what happened next changed the way everyone looked at him. Jordan's eyes swept the lobby once more, registering every gleam of marble, the muted chatter of early arrivals, and Rose's attentive posture. Everything changed after that moment. A flicker of something familiar, a watch, slightly scuffed, peeking from beneath his sleeve, caught her eye. Something in his quiet, measured approach hinted at depth, capability, and unspoken history. She kept watching. He had no idea what that small detail would reveal. And then, just as the first rays of sun hit the upper floors, a child's voice, soft, deliberate, uttered a single word that made the room shift imperceptibly, "Daddy." The name hung in the air, and Rose's gaze softened ever so slightly, her polished demeanor flickering with unanticipated recognition, leaving the morning suspended on the edge of revelation, the full story yet to unfold. Rose Whitaker did not usually stop in the lobby. People moved around her too carefully for that. Executives straightened their ties when she passed. Assistants lowered their voices. Even the security guards seemed to breathe differently around her. But that morning, she lingered. The marble floor reflected the pale Manhattan sunrise, casting long streaks of gold beneath the towering glass walls, and for reasons she could not explain, her eyes kept drifting back toward the quiet black man near the maintenance cart. Jordan Blackwell moved with the calm rhythm of someone who had learned long ago not to waste energy trying to impress strangers. He wiped down the brass railing beside the elevator, then crouched slightly to zip up Lila's backpack after it slipped open. The little girl blinked sleepily, rubbing one eye with the sleeve of her sweater. "You hungry, baby girl?" Jordan asked softly. His voice carried warmth without performance. Lila nodded once. Jordan reached into the worn lunch bag hanging from the cart and handed her half a granola bar before taking a sip from his coffee that had already gone cold. Rose watched the interaction longer than she intended to. Something about it unsettled her. Not because it was dramatic. Quite the opposite. It was ordinary. Steady. Real. In her world, people performed kindness like it was currency. But Jordan's care for his daughter looked instinctive, almost invisible. Like breathing. "Miss Whitaker," her assistant called carefully from behind. "The board is already upstairs." Rose barely reacted. Her attention remained fixed on the old toolbox beside Jordan's cart. Scratched metal. Faded stickers. Years of wear. Yet every tool inside was perfectly arranged. Nothing loose. Nothing neglected. It reminded her of military discipline. Or grief. Sometimes the two looked the same. Then Jordan noticed a spilled coffee near the revolving doors. A man in an expensive navy suit muttered under his breath and stepped around it without stopping. Jordan moved immediately, setting down his rag before anyone asked. No irritation. No complaint. Just quiet action. Rose narrowed her eyes slightly. Most people did not move that quickly unless they were afraid of losing something. Jordan did it because he saw a problem that needed handling. There was a difference. Lila suddenly looked up from her backpack and noticed Rose standing there. The child tilted her head curiously. "Daddy," she whispered, not quietly enough. "That lady looks sad." The words hit the air softly, but they landed hard. Rose froze for half a second. Jordan's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Embarrassment flickered across his face before he gently touched Lila's shoulder. "We do not talk about people like that, sweetheart." But Lila kept staring. Children often noticed what adults spent years hiding. Rose felt something tighten in her chest. Sad was not a word anyone had ever used for her. Powerful. Intelligent. Demanding. Elegant. Difficult. She had heard all of those. But not sad. Jordan looked up then, finally meeting Rose's eyes directly. There was no pity in his expression. Somehow that made it worse. "I am sorry," he said calmly. "She means well." Rose opened her mouth to dismiss it, but the words caught somewhere behind her polished composure. Because the child was not wrong. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant hum of elevators and the muted rhythm of the city waking outside the glass walls. Then something else caught Rose's attention. A folded piece of paper partially sticking out from Jordan's toolbox. A child's drawing. Crayon marks. 3 figures holding hands beneath a crooked yellow sun. One of the figures was unmistakably him. The second was Lila. The third figure, taller, with long brown hair, wore a dress colored in red. Rose stared at it for a moment too long. Something felt wrong. Or maybe familiar. Jordan noticed where her eyes landed and quietly slid the paper deeper into the toolbox without explanation. But not before Rose saw the name written in uneven handwriting at the top of the page. Miss Rose. Everything changed after that moment. Rose Whitaker spent the entire board meeting pretending she had forgotten about the drawing. Quarterly projections flashed across the massive screen. Numbers climbed. Executives spoke in polished corporate language that sounded expensive and empty at the same time. But somewhere beneath the low hum of discussion, her mind kept drifting back to the uneven crayon letters written across that folded paper inside Jordan Blackwell's toolbox. Miss Rose. The name should not have bothered her. Yet it lingered. By noon, Manhattan sunlight poured through the glass tower, turning the executive floor into a reflection of silver and gold. Rose stood near the window with untouched coffee cooling beside her. 30 stories below, the city moved with relentless urgency. Black SUVs slid through traffic. Horns echoed faintly upward. Somewhere in all of it, Jordan was probably still pushing that maintenance cart through hallways most executives never noticed. Her assistant stepped carefully into the office. "Your father is waiting downstairs," she said quietly. Rose closed her eyes for half a second. Edward Whittaker never waited for anyone. Not even his daughter. The private dining room inside Whittaker Holdings overlooked the river, all dark wood and quiet wealth. Edward sat at the center table wearing a charcoal suit that looked as sharp as his reputation. At 72, he carried authority the way other men carried wallets. Effortlessly. He glanced up when Rose entered. "You are late." "I was working." "So was I." A waiter poured sparkling water into crystal glasses before disappearing again. Edward studied his daughter carefully. "You look distracted." Rose leaned back slightly. "You brought me here to discuss my emotional state." "I brought you here because the board keeps asking when you intend to settle down." There it was. Business disguised as family concern. Rose stared at the city beyond the window. "I am not discussing marriage during lunch. At your age, discussions become decisions." His voice remained calm, almost casual, which somehow made it heavier. Edward Whittaker believed life could be organized into transactions. Investments. Acquisitions. Strategic alignments. Even love sounded like a merger when he described it. Rose had spent most of her adult life resisting becoming another extension of his empire. "You already have candidates in mind, I assume," she said dryly. Edward gave a faint smile. "Several." Rose almost laughed. Of course he did. Men with family names polished enough to sit beside hers at charity galas and political fundraisers. Men who knew how to shake hands while looking over someone's shoulder toward greater opportunity. Her father continued speaking, but her attention drifted when she noticed movement outside the restaurant window below. Across the street, near the service entrance of the building, Jordan stood beside his old pickup truck helping Lila climb carefully into the passenger seat. The truck looked older than some of the interns upstairs, faded blue paint catching the afternoon light. Jordan handed the little girl her lunchbox before adjusting her coat collar against the wind. Small things. Thoughtful things. He moved slowly, attentively, like someone who understood that children remembered details adults forgot. Rose kept watching. Edward noticed. "Who is that?" he asked suddenly. Rose looked away too quickly. "No one." But Edward followed her line of sight anyway. His eyes narrowed almost immediately at Jordan's uniform. "Maintenance?" Rose said nothing. Edward took a slow sip of water. "You always had a habit of noticing people beneath your station." The sentence landed colder than he intended. Rose's jaw tightened slightly. Across the street, Jordan opened the truck door for Lila before walking around to the driver's side. The little girl looked up through the windshield at something he said, then smiled in a way children only smiled when they felt completely safe. Something shifted quietly inside Rose watching that moment. Not attraction. Not yet. Something deeper. Recognition. Then Edward spoke again. "Men like that survive life," he said flatly. "They do not build it." Rose's eyes returned to Jordan just as he paused beside the truck, noticing an elderly doorman struggling with 2 heavy grocery bags near the curb. Without hesitation, Jordan handed Lila the keys, crossed the sidewalk, and lifted the bags for the man before he was even asked. No cameras. No audience. Just instinct. Rose watched the older man smile with visible relief while Jordan nodded politely and walked back toward the truck like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Edward saw it too. But unlike Rose, his expression did not soften. It sharpened. Interesting, he murmured quietly. And for the first time that day, Rose realized her father was paying attention. The following Friday evening, Whitaker Holdings hosted one of its private charity galas inside the Grand Meridian Hotel overlooking Central Park. Crystal chandeliers spilled warm light across polished marble floors while soft piano music floated through the ballroom like expensive perfume. Men in tailored tuxedos moved through clusters of investors and politicians with practiced confidence. Women in elegant gowns laughed carefully over champagne glasses that cost more than most people's monthly rent. It was the kind of room built entirely on appearances. Rose Whitaker stood near the center of it all wearing a black silk dress that matched the sharp composure in her expression. Cameras loved her because she never seemed surprised by anything. But tonight her attention drifted too often toward the entrance. Edward noticed immediately. "You are distracted again," he said quietly beside her. "You keep saying that like it is unusual. For you, it is." Before Rose could respond, movement near the ballroom doors shifted the energy in the room slightly. Jordan Blackwell stepped inside holding Lila's hand. Conversations did not stop completely, but they slowed enough to be noticed. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Jordan wore a clean but modest charcoal suit that fit like it had been worn carefully for years rather than purchased yesterday. His shoes were polished, though the leather showed age near the seams. Lila wore a small cream-colored dress with ribbons in her braids, clutching the same little backpack she carried every morning. Jordan paused just inside the doorway, visibly aware that he did not belong in rooms like this. But he did not shrink either. He simply adjusted Lila's coat gently and kept walking. Rose felt something tighten unexpectedly in her chest watching that moment. Most men entering this room tried too hard. Jordan was doing the opposite. Edward's expression hardened almost instantly. "You invited maintenance staff to my gala," he asked without looking at her. "I invited a father and his daughter. There is a difference." "Not to me." Edward finally turned toward her then, his eyes sharp with disbelief. Across the ballroom, Jordan crouched slightly to speak quietly to Lila while she stared up at the chandeliers with wide-eyed wonder. "Looks like a castle," she whispered. Jordan smiled faintly. "Just a fancy room, baby girl." "No," she said softly. "Fancy people forget to smile this much." The comment almost made Rose laugh despite herself. Nearby guests overheard enough to glance awkwardly into their champagne glasses. Children had a way of pulling truth into the open before adults could hide from it. Jordan noticed the stares almost immediately. Years of being underestimated had sharpened his instincts. He rested one protective hand lightly against Lila's shoulder and calmly guided her toward the refreshment table near the windows. No defensiveness. No anger. Just quiet awareness. Rose kept watching him from across the room. The city skyline glowed beyond the ballroom glass like scattered gold against the dark Manhattan night. Somewhere between the music, the laughter, and the endless networking conversations, Jordan looked strangely untouched by all of it. Like a man standing beside a storm without letting it change him. "He is uncomfortable," Rose said quietly. Edward gave a cold smile. "Good. That means he understands reality." But even as he said it, Edward noticed something irritating. Jordan was not embarrassing himself. In fact, people kept subtly gravitating toward him. A hotel waiter struggling with a heavy tray received immediate help from Jordan before anyone else reacted. An elderly donor who nearly dropped her purse found Jordan already steadying it for her with polite calm. No performance. No attempt to impress. Just instinctive kindness. Rose noticed the same thing. So did the room. Slowly. Quietly. Then Lila spotted Rose standing near the ballroom staircase. Her face brightened instantly. Without hesitation, the little girl waved excitedly across the crowded gala floor. "Miss Rose." The voice echoed louder than expected through the elegant room. Several conversations stopped completely. Jordan froze for half a second, clearly mortified by the attention, but Rose did something no one anticipated. She smiled back. A real smile this time. Soft. Unguarded. Edward saw it clearly. And for the first time that evening, something inside him shifted from irritation into concern. After the gala, Jordan returned to the maintenance floor, the soft hum of fluorescent lights above providing a quiet contrast to the evening chaos he had just navigated. Lila clutched his hand as they moved past the polished walls and glass doors that led to offices he rarely entered. The hallway smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and machine oil, a combination so familiar that it grounded him after the surreal elegance of the ballroom. He set Lila's backpack gently on the counter and knelt to check the contents, making sure her granola bar had not been crushed and the juice box was still sealed. Even in small, ordinary actions, his focus remained undivided, as if the tiny details were the most important measures of his day. He glanced toward the clock. His shift would continue for another hour, but he already felt the lingering tension of being observed, though not yet by anyone in authority. Something had shifted tonight. The way Rose Whittaker had smiled at Lila, the way she had acknowledged him without words, had left an imprint he could not ignore. He straightened, wiping grease from his hands on a worn rag, and then noticed the old toolbox tucked beneath the counter. He opened it carefully, inspecting each tool, a small ritual of order and pride that no one outside his world understood. The tools were not new, but they were cared for, cleaned, and arranged as if the world outside might someday demand proof of competence that his reputation could not provide. At that moment, the service elevator chimed and Rose's polished heels clicked against the tile floor, slow and deliberate, as she stepped into the maintenance area. She paused at the threshold, taking in the rows of cleaning supplies, the dull gray of cement floors, and Jordan standing upright, still composed despite the contrast between him and the opulent rooms she had just left. Her eyes flicked to Lila, now arranging colored pencils in a small tin, and then back to Jordan. He did not smile, did not perform, but there was a calm confidence in his posture that made her pause, almost as if he carried a world she had never noticed. "I wanted to see where my daughter goes after school," Rose said, her voice even but carrying the weight of curiosity rather than command. Jordan nodded politely, not stiffly, simply acknowledging her presence. "She likes to be involved," he said. "I keep things organized for her." The simplicity of the answer, the lack of any hidden agenda, drew Rose in. She observed the way he carefully adjusted Lila's coat collar and straightened the backpack strap, small gestures that spoke volumes about his attention and priorities. No one else in the building would have cared enough to notice, yet here he was, consistently attentive, quietly teaching his daughter responsibility and respect without a word of lecture. Rose's gaze softened slightly, her mind tracing back the moment in the ballroom, the child calling her name across the crowd, and now seeing Jordan's careful handling of Lila's routine, a continuity she had not expected. Lila looked up at Jordan and whispered something that made him tilt his head and smile faintly. "Yes, baby girl, that is exactly right," he said gently, and then glanced toward Rose. Something shifted in that glance, subtle yet undeniable. A respect forming without any spoken contract, a recognition of integrity and care that transcended wealth and power. Rose stepped closer, intrigued by the quiet authority he held, the dignity and the simplicity of his actions, and the childlike trust that seemed to orbit him effortlessly. Jordan, sensing her attention but not changing his pace, continued his careful organization, unaware of the seeds he had just planted in the mind of a woman who had been conditioned to expect performance and display rather than sincerity. Then Lila tugged lightly on his sleeve, holding up a small drawing she had made earlier, a scene of their apartment and the two of them, with a figure beside them sketched in vibrant red. Jordan's eyes met hers, acknowledging the gesture with a nod, but he did not yet notice that Rose's gaze had lingered on the paper, curiosity flickering across her face. The quiet tableau set the stage for a deeper understanding yet to come, a revelation that the little girl's simple act had already begun to unlock. 2 nights later, Edward Whittaker invited Jordan and Lila to a private dinner at the Whittaker estate overlooking the Hudson River. The invitation itself felt unusual enough that Jordan almost declined. Men like Edward Whittaker did not casually open the doors of their world to maintenance workers from downtown office towers. But Rose had personally called him earlier that afternoon, her voice calm and measured. "My father wants to thank you properly for helping during the gala," she had explained. Jordan understood immediately that gratitude was not the real reason. Wealthy men rarely invited people into their homes unless they were studying them. Still, when he looked across the small apartment and saw Lila carefully brushing the wrinkles from her dress with serious concentration, he quietly agreed. The Whittaker mansion stood behind black iron gates and long stone driveways lined with trimmed hedges glowing beneath warm landscape lights. Lila stared out the truck window in complete silence as Jordan parked beside luxury vehicles worth more than his apartment building. "Daddy," she whispered softly, "do people really live like this?" Jordan glanced at the mansion windows reflecting gold against the dark night sky. "Some do. Would you want to?" He paused before answering. "Big houses still get lonely, baby girl." Inside, everything smelled faintly of cedarwood, polished marble, and expensive candles. Staff members moved silently through the hallways carrying silver trays and folded napkins with almost military precision. Jordan noticed every detail immediately. Years of being underestimated had sharpened his observation skills. He saw how quickly servants lowered their eyes. How carefully conversations paused when Edward entered the room. Money changed spaces. It changed breathing. Rose appeared near the staircase wearing a deep emerald dress that matched the quiet elegance in her posture. She looked different here. Less corporate. More guarded somehow. Like the house belonged to her father more than it ever belonged to her. Lila smiled instantly when she saw her. "Miss Rose." Rose's expression softened automatically. "Hi, sweetheart." Edward Whittaker stepped forward a moment later, glass of bourbon resting loosely in one hand. His sharp gaze swept across Jordan slowly, evaluating him the way investors evaluated risk. "Mr. Blackwell," he said evenly. "Thank you for coming." Jordan nodded politely. "Thank you for inviting us, sir." Dinner unfolded beneath a crystal chandelier large enough to light an entire apartment. Silverware gleamed beneath soft candlelight while city reflections shimmered through the enormous windows behind them. Lila sat unusually still at first, intimidated by the formality surrounding her, until Rose quietly slid the bread basket closer and whispered, "Trust me. The rolls are the best part." That small kindness eased the tension immediately. Across the table, Edward noticed it. He noticed everything. So, he began calmly, cutting into his steak with measured precision. "How long have you worked maintenance?" Jordan set down his fork carefully before answering. "Almost 4 years at Granite Media." "Before that?" "Different jobs." Edward leaned back slightly. "That sounds intentionally vague." Rose looked up immediately, sensing the shift beneath the conversation. Jordan remained calm. "Just honest." Edward gave a faint smile that never reached his eyes. "And raising a child alone while working night shifts pays the bills." There it was. Not quite an insult. Worse. A quiet dissection disguised as polite curiosity. Lila lowered her eyes toward her plate. Jordan noticed instantly. "We get by," he answered evenly. Edward swirled the bourbon slowly in his glass. "I imagine survival takes discipline. It takes priorities." Jordan's tone remained respectful, but something in the room changed after that sentence. Rose felt it immediately. So did Edward. The older man studied Jordan more carefully now, almost irritated by the fact that the conversation refused to unbalance him. Most people either shrank around wealth or performed for it. Jordan did neither. He simply answered. Quietly. Directly. Then Edward glanced toward Lila. And what exactly do you tell your daughter about success? The question hung heavily beneath the chandelier light. Rose subtly tensed. Something about Edward's voice carried intention now. Jordan looked at Lila before responding. His expression softened slightly. I tell her success is being able to sleep at night knowing you did not become cruel to survive. Silence followed. Complete silence. Even the staff near the doorway seemed to pause. Edward's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Rose stared down at her wine glass, suddenly unable to ignore the truth buried inside Jordan's words. Then Lila quietly reached into her small bag and pulled out another folded drawing. She placed it carefully beside Jordan's plate before anyone could stop her. Edward's gaze dropped toward the paper. And for the first time all evening, his expression changed completely. The drawing sat quietly beside Jordan's dinner plate while the chandelier light reflected against the crystal glasses between them. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Lila had already returned to eating her mashed potatoes, completely unaware that her small gesture had shifted the atmosphere inside the room. Edward Whittaker stared at the paper longer than expected. 3 figures stood beneath a crooked yellow sun drawn in thick crayon lines. Jordan, Lila, and Rose. The figure beside them wore a long emerald-colored dress almost identical to the one Rose wore tonight. Above the drawing, in careful uneven handwriting, Lila had written one sentence. People look happier when Miss Rose is here. Rose felt heat rise unexpectedly into her face. Edward's eyes slowly lifted from the paper toward his daughter. Then toward Jordan. The silence became heavier. Not hostile. Worse. Thoughtful. Jordan reached for the drawing calmly and folded it once with gentle care before slipping it back toward Lila. That was not meant for everyone, baby girl. Lila frowned slightly. But it is true. Edward leaned back in his chair, bourbon glass still resting loosely in his hand. Children say honest things, he murmured quietly. Rose recognized that tone immediately. Her father only became quiet when he was thinking strategically. That worried her more than anger ever could. Dinner ended shortly afterward beneath polite conversation that never fully recovered its rhythm. By the time Jordan and Lila stepped outside onto the mansion driveway, cold night air rolled softly off the river, carrying the distant hum of Manhattan traffic beneath the stars. Jordan helped Lila into the truck carefully before shutting the passenger door. He stood there for a moment afterward, one hand resting against the roof of the old pickup, exhaling slowly into the night. Something about the evening had unsettled him. Not because of the wealth. He had seen rich people before. It was the way Edward Whittaker watched people that bothered him. Like every conversation was an investment calculation waiting for profit or disappointment. Mr. Blackwell. Jordan turned at the sound of Rose's voice behind him. She stood near the stone staircase wrapped in a dark wool coat now, her elegance softened slightly by the cold breeze moving strands of hair loose around her face. Without the dining room lights and polished atmosphere, she looked strangely tired. Human. You did not have to stay, Jordan said politely. Neither did you. A faint smile touched his face briefly before disappearing. Rose glanced toward the truck window where Lila was already half asleep against the seatbelt. She is a good kid. Jordan's eyes softened instantly at the mention of his daughter. She makes it easy to keep trying. Rose looked down at the driveway stones for a moment before speaking again. My father can be difficult. Jordan gave a quiet nod. I noticed. Surprisingly, Rose laughed softly at that. The sound caught Jordan off guard because it felt real. Not rehearsed. Not polished for investors or cameras. Just genuine amusement breaking through exhaustion. The mansion lights glowed behind her while silence stretched comfortably between them for several seconds. Then Rose looked at him more carefully. Most people try very hard to impress my father. Jordan adjusted the sleeve of his old coat thoughtfully before answering. Most people probably need something from him. And you do not. His gaze shifted briefly toward Lila sleeping inside the truck. No, ma'am. The answer came so simply that Rose felt it settle somewhere deeper than she expected. Jordan was not performing humility. He genuinely meant it. That realization disturbed something inside her because she suddenly understood what her father had noticed too. Jordan Blackwell could not be controlled through status or money because the center of his life already existed inside that old pickup truck. Rose wrapped her coat tighter against the wind. You know, she said carefully, my father is probably going to test you. Jordan looked back toward the mansion windows glowing gold against the darkness. He already is. Rose studied him quietly then. Most men became defensive under pressure from powerful people. Jordan only became calmer. Like hardship had already taught him what mattered and what did not. Somewhere behind them, through the massive estate windows, Edward Whittaker stood alone in his study watching the entire exchange from the shadows. His expression remained unreadable as his fingers rested lightly against the rim of his bourbon glass. Then his eyes drifted slowly toward the drawing still folded beside Jordan's empty dinner plate on the dining room table. And for reasons he could not fully explain yet, the sight of his daughter sketched beside that quiet black single father unsettled him more than any business threat ever had. The following morning, Manhattan was cloaked in a soft drizzle that made the sidewalk slick and reflective, a muted mirror to the overcast sky. Jordan Blackwell pushed Lila's small hand carefully as they navigated the puddles leading to the Queen's School entrance. Her backpack bounced slightly with each step, dampened by the drizzle, and Jordan adjusted the strap with a practiced gentleness that made her look up at him with trust-filled eyes. Careful, he murmured softly, his voice carrying steady reassurance. It is slippery. Lila nodded, her focus fixed on the wet pavement. In her small way, she mirrored his cautious, careful movements, learning by example. Across the street, a black SUV slowed near the curb. Rose Whittaker stepped out, umbrella in hand, her hair still damp at the ends, the emerald coat now clinging to her frame in the rain. She moved with quiet poise, every step deliberate, surveying the street as though mapping the flow of life itself. Jordan noticed her immediately, even before she reached the sidewalk. He did not move toward her, did not acknowledge her presence overtly, but kept Lila steady beside him, eyes discreetly registering Rose's approach. The child noticed first. Miss Rose! Lila exclaimed, lifting her little hand, her voice breaking the subdued rhythm of the rain with genuine excitement. Rose's face softened, and she gave a faint smile, tilting her head slightly in acknowledgement. Jordan adjusted Lila's grip on his hand and gave a gentle nod toward the SUV, guiding her toward the school entrance first. As they moved, he kept his posture steady, unshaken by the quiet scrutiny of the powerful woman now walking beside them. Inside the school, fluorescent lights buzzed softly, the hallways smelling faintly of disinfectant and old books. Children's chatter echoed off the lockers, bright and careless, and Jordan led Lila toward her classroom with calm authority, never rushing, never raising his voice. Rose followed silently, observing the interactions. She noticed the subtle discipline in the way Jordan navigated the space, how he acknowledged the janitor wiping floors, how he held the door for a teacher carrying papers, and how Lila mirrored his respectful nods to staff. Each action, ordinary to anyone else, seemed magnified under her gaze. She had seen children and parents in schools like this countless times, yet the combination of quiet confidence, attention to detail, and selfless patience in Jordan was unusual, almost magnetic. Lila stopped suddenly in front of a small locker, fumbling with the combination. Jordan bent slightly, hands poised but not intrusive, guiding her gently with minimal words. Almost there, he whispered, giving her just enough space to feel capable. Rose could not look away. In that moment, she began to understand what Edward Whittaker often overlooked: not every strength wore a visible emblem. Quiet, measured actions often carried the most weight. As Lila finally opened her locker and carefully arranged her belongings, Rose's eyes fell on the small sketch tucked between Lila's books, an old drawing of Jordan and Lila at home, crayon lines slightly smudged from repeated handling. Something familiar tugged at her chest. She stepped closer, almost unconsciously, to observe the drawing more clearly, noting the details of the figures and the uneven handwriting at the top. Jordan, noticing her attention, did not react. He simply adjusted Lila's jacket collar, his movements precise, composed, and natural. The little girl looked up and smiled, then whispered, "Daddy, she likes our drawing." Jordan nodded slightly, eyes softening, and for the first time, Rose noticed the depth of care radiating from him. Not words. Not wealth. Just presence. The silent observation, the humility, the careful attention to a child's world, this is what made him remarkable. Something shifted in Rose's chest, a quiet acknowledgement that her earlier assumptions might have been incomplete. And as Jordan and Lila moved down the hallway toward the classroom, Rose could not help but follow just a step behind, her thoughts racing, realizing that the way he treated his child revealed more than any title or bank account ever could. The child had changed the perspective of the adult woman, and Jordan remained unaware of the full impact of his ordinary, yet extraordinary, actions. That afternoon, the usual calm of the Queen streets felt unusually tense. Jordan Blackwell had parked the old pickup at the curb near Lila's school, and he watched the small figures of children moving between classrooms and playgrounds, their laughter cutting sharply through the drizzle that lingered in the air. He adjusted the strap of Lila's backpack once more, noticing the faint smudges on the worn fabric from her constant handling, proof of care and curiosity rather than neglect. Today, however, his attention was split. Across the street, a sleek black SUV idled near the corner, engine humming quietly, and Rose Whittaker stepped out, umbrella in hand. Her posture was elegant yet deliberate, striking in a way that reminded him of the gala evening, yet here she was grounded in the drizzle, navigating puddles with the same quiet observation she applied to every environment. Jordan did not greet her directly. He guided Lila forward, steadying her small steps, but his awareness extended naturally toward Rose, measuring distance, tone, and intent. Lila spotted her first, lifting her small hand and calling, "Miss Rose." Her voice rang clear and genuine across the wet sidewalk. Rose's expression softened, and she nodded toward the little girl before focusing on Jordan. There was no surprise in his glance, only a measured acknowledgement, a gentle confidence rooted in years of experience that no social hierarchy could shake. As they walked toward the school entrance, Jordan maintained his quiet authority, opening the door for Lila and stepping inside only once he had ensured her safety. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, illuminating the polished linoleum floors and casting reflections of orderly rows of lockers. Teachers and students passed, many offering cursory glances, but Jordan navigated the space with subtle care, ensuring every step for Lila was steady, every hallway interaction respectful and unobtrusive. Rose followed silently, absorbing the meticulous attention he paid to details that others ignored. She noticed the janitor passing by carrying a mop bucket. Jordan offered a nod of acknowledgement to the man and held the door open for a teacher carrying stacks of papers, never interrupting the rhythm of his responsibility. Lila, naturally attentive, mirrored her father's movements, a quiet learning unfolding between them. At the classroom door, Jordan crouched slightly, guiding Lila through the combination of locker and backpack with minimal words, allowing her to feel capable while protecting her from frustration. Rose's gaze lingered on the old crayon drawing Lila had slipped between her books earlier, the same one from the gala now accompanying her through this ordinary school day. Jordan noticed her subtle interest and did not comment, he simply completed his task with composed diligence. The child looked up at him, eyes bright, whispering, "Daddy, she likes our drawing." Jordan's soft nod, acknowledging both Lila and Rose, carried calm approval and pride without performance. Rose studied the quiet confidence radiating from him, the kind of steadfast care that had gone unnoticed in a world obsessed with visibility and titles. Something shifted in her perception. Wealth, influence, and strategy, all the measures she had relied upon to evaluate people, seemed inadequate compared to the integrity and patience displayed in these small acts. The silent observation, the unwavering focus on his child's safety and happiness, revealed a man whose value could not be quantified by status or money. And as Jordan straightened to exit the hallway with Lila, Rose's eyes caught a glimpse of the folded drawing peeking from Lila's open backpack, a detail unnoticed by anyone else, yet signaling a depth of connection and care that promised more revelations to come. By mid-afternoon, the hospital corridor smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, a mixture that somehow felt grounding after the hectic morning. Jordan Blackwell sat quietly in a plastic chair outside the pediatric wing, Lila asleep on his lap, her small breathing slow and steady. The soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead seemed almost rhythmic, echoing the pattern of his own heartbeat. He rested one hand lightly on her backpack, now placed beside him, the straps folded neatly, a small gesture of order he repeated without thought. The room was otherwise empty except for distant footsteps and the occasional soft murmur of nurses moving from room to room. Jordan's eyes scanned the long hallway, noting the arrangement of chairs, the way sunlight filtered through the blinds, the small details that gave him a sense of control in a place designed for unpredictability. Rose Whitaker appeared then, stepping lightly down the corridor from the main entrance. Her coat was wrapped tightly around her, water droplets still clinging to the fabric from the brief rain outside, hair pressed slightly by the umbrella she had carried. She paused, observing the quiet tableau before her. Jordan did not immediately acknowledge her presence. He remained attentive to Lila, adjusting the blanket over her small shoulders and smoothing the slight wrinkle in her jacket. Rose's polished expression softened imperceptibly as she watched him. There was a dignity in the stillness, a calm authority that required no words. She could see, even from a distance, the way his attention remained centered on his child. No performance. No display. Just focus. She stepped closer, allowing her heels to click softly against the linoleum floor, careful not to startle. Jordan's head lifted slightly, a polite nod toward her, the faintest smile appearing as he read her quiet recognition. Lila stirred, stretching one small arm before snuggling back against him. "Daddy, Miss Rose is here," she whispered. Jordan nodded. "Yes, baby girl." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that reflected years of responsibility and care. Rose crouched slightly to meet Lila's gaze, her presence non-threatening, her polished demeanor set aside for a moment of genuine warmth. Jordan shifted slightly, keeping Lila secure, and watched as Rose extended a hand toward the small crayon drawing Lila had tucked into her backpack earlier. "Is this yours?" Rose asked softly. Lila's eyes brightened. "Yes. Daddy helped me," she said proudly, lifting the folded paper. Jordan's hands moved to steady the child as she passed it to Rose, careful to maintain a gentle hold without interference. Rose examined the drawing with a small nod of approval, her gaze lifting to meet Jordan's. In that quiet exchange, neither spoke much, yet a subtle understanding passed between them. Jordan's focus remained split, protecting Lila, reading the space, and maintaining composure in an environment that could feel sterile or intimidating. Rose observed how naturally he navigated the balance of care, patience, and quiet authority, realizing that the child's comfort and trust were reflections of a deeper integrity. Across the corridor, the faint echo of nurses' footsteps and the distant whir of medical equipment emphasized the stillness. Jordan adjusted Lila's position, allowing her to rest fully, while Rose lingered nearby, watching the rhythm of his care, noting the patience and precision that went into each small action. The scene was ordinary on its surface, yet layered with unspoken truths, the type that revealed character more than any words could. Lila yawned softly, and Jordan tightened his hold slightly, whispering a few calm words. Rose, now closer, noticed a small detail, an old watch on his wrist, scratched and worn, a subtle sign of past challenges quietly carried. The observation made her pause. Something felt different. Something mattered more than the polished corridors and quiet professionalism surrounding them. In that suspended moment, the full impact of Jordan's quiet strength and integrity had not yet been revealed, but the seed of recognition had been planted, and Rose could not look away. The hospital corridor had grown quieter by evening, the rush of nurses and visitors fading into a softer rhythm of distant footsteps and muted conversations behind closed doors. Rain tapped lightly against the windows overlooking the city, turning the skyline into blurred reflections of gold and gray. Jordan Blackwell remained seated beneath the pale fluorescent lights, one arm resting protectively around Lila as she slept against his chest. Her small fingers still clutched the edge of the crayon drawing Rose Whitaker had carefully folded earlier and returned to her backpack. Jordan looked tired now. Not weak. Just worn in the quiet way responsible people often were after carrying too much for too long without complaint. Rose stood near the vending machines at the far end of the hallway holding 2 paper cups of coffee, hesitating longer than she expected before walking back toward him. She was not used to uncertainty. Boardrooms never unsettled her. Investors never unsettled her. Yet somehow this quiet black single father sitting beneath hospital lights made her think more carefully about every word she spoke. Jordan looked up as she approached. "You did not have to do that," he said softly, noticing the coffee. Rose handed him one of the cups anyway. "You have been here all day." Jordan accepted it with a polite nod. "Thank you." The coffee steamed faintly between his hands while silence settled comfortably around them again. It was becoming easier now, this silence between them. Less guarded. Rose glanced toward Lila sleeping peacefully against his chest. "She trusts you completely." Jordan looked down at his daughter instinctively, his expression softening in a way Rose had never seen around powerful men. "She has to," he answered quietly. "Kids should not have to wonder if somebody is coming back for them." The sentence landed heavily in the quiet corridor. Rose stared into her untouched coffee for a moment, suddenly aware that most of the men she had known spent their lives chasing importance while Jordan spent his protecting one little girl's sense of safety. The difference unsettled her more than she expected. A doctor passed by carrying a clipboard, nodding politely toward Jordan before continuing down the hall. Rose noticed it immediately. "You know the staff here?" Jordan gave a small shrug. "Lila had asthma pretty bad when she was younger. We spent enough nights in these chairs." Rose's eyes drifted toward the old watch on his wrist again, the scratched glass catching the hallway light. She had spent years around expensive watches worn like status symbols, but this one looked different. "Earned. You never talk much about yourself," she said carefully. Jordan smiled faintly without looking at her. "Most people are not really asking." Rose absorbed that quietly because she realized it was true. People saw his uniform before they saw him. Maintenance worker. Single father. Night shift employee. Labels arrived faster than curiosity. Lila stirred slightly in her sleep then whispered something barely audible against Jordan's jacket. He leaned down immediately. "I am right here, baby girl." The speed of his response made Rose's chest tighten unexpectedly. No hesitation. No distraction. Just presence. Complete and immediate. Jordan adjusted the blanket around Lila carefully before looking back toward Rose. "You should probably head home. Long day." Rose almost laughed at that. He sounded more concerned about her exhaustion than his own. "You always take care of everybody else first," she asked quietly. Jordan considered the question for a second. "Not everybody. Just the people who matter." His eyes met hers then, calm and steady beneath the pale hospital lights. "That is usually enough." Something shifted again in the silence that followed. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just 2 tired people sitting in a hallway realizing they understood loneliness in very different ways. At the far end of the corridor, Edward Whitaker stepped quietly off the elevator, having arrived later than expected after a delayed meeting downtown. He stopped the moment he saw them together. Rose sitting beside Jordan with untouched coffee in her hands. Lila asleep safely against his chest. The quiet intimacy of trust filling the sterile hospital hallway more powerfully than any grand gesture ever could. Edward remained completely still for several seconds, watching unnoticed from the shadows near the elevator doors. Then his eyes narrowed slightly as he observed something that unsettled him deeply. For the first time in years, his daughter looked peaceful. 3 days later, Whitaker Holdings held its annual foundation ceremony inside the Grand Meridian Ballroom, the same towering room where politicians, executives, and investors gathered each year beneath chandeliers bright enough to erase imperfections from a distance. Cameras flashed near the entrance while reporters murmured names into microphones, waiting for Edward Whitaker to announce the future direction of the company's charitable division. Rose stood near the stage in a cream-colored suit, composed as always, but tonight there was a quiet distance in her expression that several board members noticed immediately. Edward noticed it too. He stood beside the podium reviewing his prepared speech while assistants adjusted lighting and seating arrangements around him. Across the ballroom, Jordan Blackwell entered quietly with Lila beside him, both dressed simply but carefully. Jordan had nearly refused the invitation again, uncomfortable with rooms designed around status and spectacle, but Rose had insisted personally. Lila wanted to come, she had said over the phone, and somehow that made it harder to say no. The moment they stepped into the ballroom, Jordan felt the familiar weight of observation settle across his shoulders. Expensive suits. Measured smiles. Conversations that paused just long enough to acknowledge difference. He rested one hand lightly against Lila's shoulder as they moved toward the back of the room, instinctively protective without appearing defensive. Lila looked up at the chandeliers again with the same wonder she always carried into unfamiliar spaces. "Still looks like a castle," she whispered. Jordan smiled faintly. "Still just a room." Nearby guests overheard and exchanged restrained smiles, but Jordan remained focused on Lila, adjusting the sleeve of her small jacket and making sure she stayed close in the crowded ballroom. Rose noticed every detail from across the room. More importantly, so did Edward. The older man had spent decades studying people professionally. He understood greed within minutes. Ambition within seconds. Yet Jordan remained difficult to categorize because nothing about him seemed motivated by personal gain. That unsettled Edward more than he cared to admit. The ceremony began beneath soft piano music and applause echoing against marble walls. Edward delivered the opening remarks with practiced confidence while cameras tracked every movement. Rose stood quietly nearby, listening but distant. Jordan remained toward the back beside Lila, clearly uncomfortable with the attention surrounding powerful people. Then, midway through the presentation, one of the event coordinators rushed nervously toward the stage whispering something urgently into Edward's ear. A technical issue had interrupted part of the audiovisual system connected to the live charity broadcast. Staff members scrambled anxiously near the control station while executives exchanged frustrated glances. Edward's irritation surfaced immediately. "How difficult is it to prepare properly for one evening?" he snapped under his breath. Jordan noticed the panic from across the room before anyone asked for help. Years of maintenance work had trained him to recognize malfunction instinctively. He leaned slightly toward Lila. "Stay right here for me, baby girl." Then he crossed the ballroom calmly, moving through anxious staff without urgency or performance. Rose watched closely as Jordan crouched beside the control system near the stage, sleeves rolled carefully back, expression focused and steady beneath the ballroom lights. Within moments, his hands moved confidently across the wiring panel, identifying the issue while technicians stood frozen by pressure and embarrassment. Jordan remained calm. Quiet. Precise. The giant screens flickered once before restoring perfectly, bringing the live broadcast back online just as applause resumed across the ballroom. Relief swept visibly through the staff. Edward stared at Jordan for several seconds, surprised not only by the skill itself but by the complete absence of ego afterward. Jordan simply stepped back from the equipment and nodded politely toward the technicians as if nothing remarkable had happened. No attempt to claim credit. No lingering near the spotlight. He immediately returned toward Lila. Rose felt something shift deeply inside her watching that moment. The room had been filled with powerful men all evening, yet the calmest person in the building had been the one nobody important initially noticed. As Jordan reached Lila again, the little girl looked up proudly. "I knew you could fix it," she whispered. Jordan smiled softly, kneeling to straighten the ribbon slipping from her braid. Across the ballroom, Edward Whittaker remained completely silent, his prepared speech forgotten in one hand while a realization slowly settled into his expression. For the first time in years, he was beginning to understand that the strongest man in the room was not the loudest one standing closest to power. The city lights of Manhattan glimmered like scattered jewels as Jordan Blackwell steered the old pickup down familiar streets, Lila asleep against the passenger seatbelt, her small chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. The drizzle from earlier had faded into a gentle mist, leaving the asphalt reflective, mirroring neon signs and the distant skyline. Jordan kept one hand lightly resting near her seat, instinctively protective, while his other guided the wheel steadily through the quiet traffic. Rose Whittaker walked beside the truck for a block, matching its slow pace, umbrella held casually, her presence striking against the muted glow of streetlights. She did not speak immediately, simply observing. Jordan was aware of her glance in his peripheral vision but did not allow himself to be distracted. Everything that mattered was already in the cab with him. When he parked outside the small brownstone they called home, he waited for the car to fully stop before turning to Lila. "All right, baby girl. Time to get inside." Her small hands gripped his tightly, and he guided her carefully down the wet curb. Rose followed silently, close enough to notice the small details, worn edges of the backpack, scuffed shoes, faint grease on his sleeve from his day's work. None of it diminished the quiet strength radiating from him. Inside the apartment, warm light spilled over modest furniture and framed drawings on the walls, evidence of careful parenting and love that required no decoration. Jordan set Lila down gently and adjusted her blanket for the night, a ritual of care performed without expectation of praise. Rose stood near the doorway, studying the interaction. The way he moved, attentive and patient, revealed a steadiness that no title or wealth could replicate. Lila yawned and stretched, glancing at Rose. "She is always happy here," Jordan said softly, not needing to elaborate further. Rose's eyes lingered on him, realizing that the foundation of trust and safety he had built was invisible to most yet absolute in its impact. They all remained silent for a few moments, enveloped in the quiet intimacy of the space. Outside, city sounds continued, distant traffic, a dog barking faintly, the whisper of wind through bare trees. Inside, 3 people occupied the room, a little girl sleeping peacefully, a black single father exuding quiet dignity and unwavering responsibility, and a white woman who had been conditioned to value power and wealth yet now watched the simplicity of care and integrity with a new perspective. Jordan quietly retrieved Lila's drawing from the table and placed it atop her bedside. His eyes lingered on the small figure representing Rose, the name inscribed in Lila's careful handwriting. He did not speak. Rose felt the weight of the gesture, understanding, without words, that his actions held more significance than any demonstration of wealth or status ever could. The room hummed with ordinary life, yet within its stillness existed a quiet revelation. Jordan had not sought recognition. He had not sought approval. He had only acted out of care and responsibility. Rose caught herself smiling faintly, a real smile this time, as she observed the integrity and dignity radiating from him. Lila stirred in her sleep again, reaching for the blanket Jordan had tucked around her, and he adjusted it without looking away from Rose. Outside, the city carried on, oblivious to the quiet revolution occurring in that small apartment, the silent assertion that kindness and presence could outweigh expectation and judgment. For a brief moment, the 3 of them existed in a perfect equilibrium, the day's events drawing the invisible threads of trust and respect closer,